As we begin today, it is important to acknowledge that we are filming in Lloydminster on the border of Alberta and Saskatchewan in the heart of Treaty 6 territory. Before the arrival of the explorers and settlers, many First Nations traveled through and thrived in this area, which also includes the homeland of the Métis. I was born here, but I chose to return here as an adult. And now, after unlearning what I was taught in public school in the 1970s and 1980s, and relearning a less whitewashed history of this place, I see this land and its stories through very different eyes. I recognize that the roots of my family on the prairies came at the cost of the First Nations people who were here long before. Their land was taken so that my ancestors could farm and build their lives in this place that became known as Canada. I cannot change the past, but I can try to move forward in a good way by sharing what I've learned about the Indigenous peoples whose teachings are woven into this land and all it encompasses. This episode focuses on Chief Sweetgrass of Sweetgrass First Nation on Treaty 6 territory in what is now known as Saskatchewan. I first heard some of these stories on the land in the summer of 2025 during a culture camp hosted by the community. Versions of some of these stories have also been recorded in Cree. We hear the story of how the young boy formerly known as No Name, or the boy with no name, arrived in this territory and eventually earned his name. Wes also shares thoughts on leadership qualities and treaty negotiations. He tells a beautiful story about traditional courting practices and how young Sweetgrass entices a brave young woman to ride with him on his black stallion. We end by returning to a recurring theme, the power of stories and listening. Mr. Fine Day is sharing stories as he knows and has experienced them, which may differ from those told within other Indigenous communities and settler institutions. Throughout the series, we discuss various plants and traditional healing methods. This is not intended to replace medical advice from trained healthcare providers. Some episodes contain graphic descriptions of events witnessed and experienced by the guest at his time in residential school and at various points throughout his life. They may spark emotions, memories, and questions, so we are asked to listen with open hearts and minds. Viewer discretion is advised. When we were out at Sweetgrass First Nation for the culture camp in July, we talked quite a bit about Chief Sweetgrass. And as you talk about, characteristics of, leadership and humility and sacrifice, I'm just reminded of him.
And he was unique in a sense, right from his introduction to the Cree community, because he was not Cree by blood, by birth. He was born in the what we refer to as the Kahkaguachiwininak, Kahkaguachiwinoak, the Raven Hills people. And that's in the States somewhere, and today their descendants are known as the Crow tribe. So wherever they are, that's where Sweetgrass, initially came from. And it was because in the springtime, a party of Okichichtawak, the seasoned warriors, the worthy ones, had decided in the Warriors' Lodge that they would go on an expedition to see if they could acquire some horses and, other goods by going to raid other camps, which often also returned the favor, So that was one of the ways of acquiring things was, through the warrior societies, and they were expected to go and bring stuff, and distribute it to the community. But they came upon that Crow camp, that what we refer to as Crow today, but to the Kakwaguachiwinowak, the Raven Hills people, the people of the Black Bird, was how they were described, the Great Black Thunder. That was their patron spirit, you could say.
And so this is different translations of Great Black Thunder to Raven to Crow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the first one was a spiritual, you see, the
Right.
Black Thunders.
Right.
The Great Black Thunder Bird was the one that looked after them as a community. But those warriors made it down there. They found out where the horses were, and when there was an opportune moment, they grabbed what horses they could, and then they herded the rest, which all headed towards the camp. So they were herding this herd of horses through the camp, and all the people started running, trying to find shelter so they wouldn't get trampled by these horses, and also by these raiders, who could kill them or would kill them if they had the chance. And those horses were being stampeded throughout the camp, and one of the warriors saw a little boy who had been left by his family or his mother or somebody. He was a little boy that was running alone, trying to follow the people who were escaping. And as he rode by there, he reached down and grabbed that little boy by the arm and pulled him up and set him in front of him on the horse, and brought him back. They came back with a herd of horses and this little boy that warrior had grabbed. And there was a couple in the camp that had recently lost a little boy around that same age, and they were still grieving. And that warrior took that boy to that couple and asked them if they would like to raise him. But they had to teach him about the culture, about survival, about all of the things that are necessary for a productive human being. And they agreed. And so he was given to them. But nobody knew his lineage or lineage, or, they had no idea whose child that was and what that child's name was. So in our community, he became the boy with no name. No name. And that's how he was known for his growing up until he came about almost 16 winters, they said. And he used to go down and try to eavesdrop on the warriors, trying to get information about when they might be planning another expedition, because he wanted to go somewhere. He wanted to earn a name, is what he wanted, because no name was not a very worthy name. It just described his circumstances as people saw him. And he wanted to have a chance to go follow the warriors, travel with them, and do something so brave that, and they would witness that. And when he came back to camp and told that story, they could say, yes, I was there, I saw that, he speaks the truth. And from there, a name would arise and be given. But those warriors knew these young boys had been trying to eavesdrop, and what they did, was that they left in the middle of the night when all these young kids had gone to bed, because they did not want inexperienced young boys traveling with them or following them around, because that could put them in danger, because of their inexperience. Or if they were attacked, then they would have to be not only looking at the enemy, the threat, but also trying to keep these, little ones from being killed, and it would be distracting.
Right.
So when No Name went to the warrior's lodge, and it was empty except for a few old men, he realized that they had already left. And so he set out and he circled the camp looking for tracks. Which way did these people go,
Yeah.
And he thought he found tracks, and he decided to follow them. And he went to the woman who had raised him, his grandmother, and told her he wanted to follow these warriors. And so she had made a few pairs of moccasins for him, because to walk a long ways, you need, more than a pair of moccasins, or you're gonna be having to travel barefoot. And but she made him a few pairs of moccasins to take along, and a bag of meat flakes, Âsokan, we say,
Okay.
crushed meat, which is just powdered meat. A little bag of that, and she gave him a knife to help him. You know, I mean, that they were not rich. But she wanted him, if he's going out, don't be defenseless.
Yeah.
These may help you, they may help you to survive. And so he set out, and he never did catch up to those warriors. He just kept heading to the west. And he had traveled for about 7 days, 7 nights. And he had hidden in a bush on a hill. And he was walking, and he came to another little hill, and he climbed that, and there was this huge camp. And you could tell from how the teepee poles were arranged that this was not a Cree camp. This was somebody else. And so he stayed hidden for a couple of days, and he traveled around, sneaking around during the evening around that camp, looking, do they have horses? Where do they keep them? And he found a place nearby where there was a herd of horses that were being kept, and usually guarded only by one person, as he saw. And he decided he would try and get those horses. And towards after, at night, he went back to that place, and that person who was guarding those horses had a little fire going and was sitting there. And this young boy, Noni, attacked him, surprised him, and managed to kill him with that knife that his grandmother had given him to take along. And after he killed him, he took what valuables that the person had, and then took one of the horses and began to herd the other horses east, trying to get back into Cree country. And he was so afraid that these people would have other horses that they could use to come after him. So he was too afraid to stop and rest. And he just kept riding, and for 2 days and 2 nights, and he would only stop for brief periods of time so those horses could drink and, eat some grass, and then he would be back on the trail again. And it took him, I believe it was after he had ridden for 2 days and 2 nights straight without stopping, only to feed and water those horses. And third morning he came to familiar territory and knew he was coming into, close to the Cree camp, because it was Cree territory. And there would be scouts about. Untawak, because one of their jobs was to patrol the boundaries of Cree country and ensure that there were no strangers, who had any intent of surprising them and doing what they had gone to do. But those scouts saw him, and I believe he had 32 head of horses. And those scouts went over there, and they could tell he was tired because he was falling asleep on his horse and just waking up and grabbing on. And they told him, "Don't worry about your horses. We'll take them into camp for you. You go home and sleep."
Mm-hmm.
And so he went to his grandmother's, and he slept for a whole day and a whole night. He was so burned out and tired that he slept for that whole period of time. And then, in the afternoon, he woke up and his grandmother fed him. And then there was a meeting called by the chief. And they had had a feast, pipe ceremony, being thankful for his safe return. Not only for his safe return, but what he had brought back, and so after they had eaten and after the pipe had been smoked, they asked him, "Atimo, tell your story."
Mm.
And he got up while someone sang, and he began to dance, and he began to talk about his journey to the West and how he had wanted to catch up to these warriors he had not realized that they had left, but he wanted to join them somehow. And so he traveled by himself, hiding out in the bushes during the day and traveling at night just for safety, and how he had stumbled upon this encampment of people and spent 2 days scouting around there, trying to get the lay of the land and the community and the horses and the paths, and then how he had gone and he had killed that horse guard. And after he was dead, he said, "I reached down and I pulled up a handful of grass because my knife was all bloody, and I wiped the blood off my knife on that grass. And if I did not make it back, or if I lost this herd, and I told that story, there would be no one to say, I was there. I witnessed that.
Mm-hmm.
He speaks the truth." So he thought, "I'll take this grass along, because when I talk about how I killed this guard, I can say, and I wiped his blood off my knife on this grass." And that's what he did. When he got back to camp and he told his story, he talked about how he had been involved in that battle and killed that horse guard, and rode 2 days and 2 nights straight, and on the third morning came upon the scouts who were patrolling the boundaries of Cree country. And the people listened. And when he talked about the fight, and he took that grass out of his belt, and he said, and this is where I wiped that man's blood off my knife with. And he had come back with 32 horses, but he had demonstrated his courage, his fearlessness, by doing that alone, you see. And when he came back to camp, well, actually, after he had showed them the grass with this warrior's blood on it, the chief asked him, Astam, come, let me see that. And he walked over and he handed that grass to the chief, and the chief looked at the blood, and he looked at the grass, and he looked at that young man, and he said, Wihkaswa ohe. This is Sweetgrass. And he looked and he said, from this moment on, no one will ever address you or refer to you as the one with no name. From this moment on, when someone addresses you or speaks of you, they will refer to you as Wihkaskuksein, old Sweetgrass spirit. Yes. And that became his name. And it's significant, he was not a blood member of the community, and as an immigrant, he had to try hard because the opportunities just weren't there for him. The support wasn't there for him except for his grandmother, and some of her relatives. So he struggled, as a young boy. But after he got that name, and then, in the next day or a couple of days, he went and got his horses, and he distributed them to old people who had no young ones to help them. He gave horses to widows who had children that they were raising alone. He gave out his treasures to the poorest of the poor. And in those days, it was customary that if someone gave me something, I should try and give them something of equal or greater value, because I did not want to be seen as someone who simply sits around collecting, or without ever attempting to give back at least equal what you had received. And he kept the horse for his mother, and he kept, I believe it was 2 horses for himself, and one was a big black stallion that was so wild, they said no one except Sweetgrass could get near it and ride it. Anybody else would be getting chased and kicked and stomped and and whacked about by that horse. It had just had developed that connection with this man. And he had demonstrated his fearlessness, even though he could not find the group of warriors that had left without him. He still continued, he persevered, and he came to an enemy camp. And he took their horses and brought them back, and in the home community, he distributed those horses to the poorest of the poor and the most needy, who he knew would never have a chance of being able to give him anything near equal to what he had given to them. But that was not why he gave it to them. And he gave it to them out of the goodness of his heart and wanting to help make their lives easier. He truly cared about the people. And he had made a massive economic investment in the community with that herd of horses that he had brought. And so his fearlessness, his generosity, and his ability to provide not only for himself but for the entire community were were the three of the things that would help to fast track you into the role of leadership.
Right.
There were other things, and but those were three really critical things that he had demonstrated as a young boy, and they knew this one will be a leader.
Yeah.
And when he was older, the only person that had equal standing among the Cree was Mr. Himasqua, Big Bear. And so they were the two chiefs who could speak for the nation, who had the authority to make treaties, see, and to negotiate treaties. And, if there was any question about directions being taken or decisions being made, they would sit in silence and defer, let other people discuss it, but for final approval, that they would be approached. And this is what we have discussed, this is what we think, and this is the course of action that we think should be followed, but it's for your approval. And he could say yes or he could say no. And that was the law, the final decision. Yeah. So him in the prairies and Big Bear from the bush, yeah, had relationships with the bush people. Sakawinawak,
What is Sakawinawak?
bush people.
Oh, bush people. Okay.
Yeah. Sakau is the forest people.
Okay.
Sakau is a forest or a bush. Yeah. But the people of the forests. Yeah.
And I mean, we see names like Big Bear and Poundmaker and Louis Riel and Gabrielle Dumont and Sweetgrass. And, we see these names and places in the history books. But again, we don't have the whole story. And then there are these oral stories that speak to their character, not just their role in history, but, their character and their leadership qualities and as humans.
Yes. And how they embodied the greatest aspects of developing to become the best version of who you could become, when you were placed here and given the circumstances. And Sweetgrass, he was around. There was a priest named Father Lacombe, who desperately wanted to convert Sweetgrass. And I don't know, they say he baptized him and gave him the name Abraham Sweetgrass, Abraham Wikaskoksay. And I'm not sure, well, I have no idea actually whether it was because he was agreeing to, okay, I'll leave everything of my past behind and I'll become your subject, and which I would find hard to believe from, the one of the most prominent leaders and greatest chiefs of his time. I mean, and who was Albert Lacon, you know?
And this was later in his life.
Yeah, yeah. But he did, and at treaty time, those priests, they were really insidious during negotiations. They would go around telling people, if you don't sign that paper, that treaty, you'll go straight to hell when you die, and all your descendants will follow you, Yeah. But when he signed treaty in 1876, and then that would have been August or September, and in November, I believe it was his brother-in-law came over to visit him, but he had been given a pistol by one of the Northwest Mounted Police guys, as an inducement to sign that treaty, along with the priest pressuring him and the police giving him a pistol and saying, you just sign that treaty. And so he had signed, and he had this pistol. And when his brother-in-law came to visit, they say that he was showing that gun to him, or he was cleaning it, or something. And his brother-in-law asked to see it, and he handed it over. And his brother-in-law didn't know that it was loaded, and pulled the trigger and shot and killed him. That was just a few months after he signed treaty. And there was, that was considered by some to be a very significant thing, that maybe that's what we get for signing treaties.
Yeah.
Our own communities will turn on us.
Mm-hmm. Like a bad omen.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yes.
You also told a story about Sweetgrass and his horse and his wife.
That horse terrified most people. And when there's a Sundance in the afternoon, more towards evening, the young men would come between the Sundance Lodge and the row of teepees on the outside. And the young men would ride around in that inner circle, singing, courting songs, see. And young women might come out and see a guy they liked and run over and jump up on the horse behind him and, be singing along with him, or just riding behind him. So, it would be known that they had interest in each other. And soon all the young men had a girl behind them on their horse, except Sweetgrass. All he had was his horse, who was snorting and dancing and prancing and not letting anybody get near. And after a few songs, riding around the camp, they were passing by the lodge of a Stoney couple who had a daughter that was grown, and she was looking at those riders and listening to the songs and looking at this man who had no one riding behind him, and realizing, well, they're afraid of his horse. So she went walking up to him and reached out her arm as that horse was dancing about. And he grabbed her by the arm and pulled her up behind him. And then he had a partner to ride behind him, like all the other men. He wasn't the only guy without a partner. And they sang and rode around, and at the end of the song, he left her where he had picked her up, and she went back to the camp, or to her parents' teepee. And he went and he got 2 horses, and he walked over, leading them to that girl's parents' lodge, and he stood out there with his horses, and he coughed or something to let them know that he was there, and they came out, saw him standing there with 2 horses, and they asked him, what would you like? And he said, I have brought these as a gift for your daughter, because she demonstrated her fearlessness and courage when everyone else was afraid to come near my horse. She was the one who had the courage to come, so where we could reach out. And she was not afraid to ride that horse. And, it was jumping and snorting, and still she came and she rode with him. And he said, I honor that type of courage. I honor her fearlessness. And to show her how grateful I was for her participation, I have come with these 2 horses. And he gave those horses to that old couple.
It's a very romantic story.
Mm-hmm. I'll have to find a couple of horses somewhere.
I don't know if it works the same way anymore. Young women might be looking for something else. I don't know.
Yeah.
And then she did end up going away with him and becoming his wife.
That part I'm not sure of.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I still have yet to come upon her name. And
Okay.
now with this infusion of influx of stories that have come back, it just gives me a lot more potential places to go and seek out what they left behind, knowing that at some point this new world, this new terrain, we would become familiar enough with it that we could move in and out of it, and find places where they had left the treasures that we would require to begin to not only survive but to thrive in this land and this new system that was being imposed on us, where we had no say, no choice, and in fact we were kept behind a buckskin curtain, away from the eyes of the rest of the world, so they could do with us as they pleased. And they did with us as they pleased, yeah. Because they were the law. Yeah. They were above the law. The Indian agents.
And so as we start to tell some of these new stories about Chief Sweetgrass, other stories are probably going to surface. That seems to be what happens.
Absolutely.
Right?
Because you help each other to remember. You trigger memories, and maybe of the same guy or maybe someone else in similar circumstances. But all of a sudden, you saw one plant here, another one appears here.
Yeah.
It's like picking medicine.
Yeah.
Spiritual food. Yeah.
And so at Sweetgrass First Nation, as far as descendants of Chief Sweetgrass, So do we know much about that part of the story?
Not that much, but I find it very interesting, for instance, that on Thunderchild, there is a family named Uikask.
Okay, which is a shortened version.
Yeah, it's sweetgrass, the
Okay.
plant,
Yeah.
Uikask.
Okay.
They're named after that. Why?
Okay.
Is it because of their connectivity and relationship to this plant? Or is there some other connection to
Right.
Uikaskuksain?
Right.
You know, where a lot of the Indian agents, they couldn't say the names,
Right.
and they could spell, I guess, some of them. But instead of saying Wikaskuksain, they might just say Wikask.
Right.
And that'll be your name now.
Yeah.
See? And I'm wondering if that's what happened. Because even in, Thunderchild, for instance, Chief Thunderchild's daughter, Apasus, she was called, Little Lodgepole. Her father was Thunderchild, and she became involved with Sam Finday, my grandfather.
Okay.
They had a baby. That baby was registered as Ed Thunderchild. And there's a whole series of descendants who did not know that my grandfather was the person who brought that part of their community.
Yeah.
And that, we didn't know we were so closely related to you,
Yeah.
But now, through these stories, we're beginning to, this information is beginning to come out.
So we don't need DNA testing, we need stories.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And if we did DNA testing, I mean, that would corroborate a lot of the oral stuff. But the fear is that it would also expose other things that, we didn't want exposed. And so we kind of kept those hidden away under the bed or, in places where they would not be readily visible.
Well, thank you for those stories of Sweetgrass. I loved hearing those this summer. And those were new stories. We've talked a little bit about him.
Mm-hmm. And I don't think that many of the band members even knew he was not a Cree. He was a guy who signed the treaty, and this is the band, But other than that, who was he? Where did he come from? How did he get his name? What were his characteristics? What was he noted for? And so for his generosity,
Yeah.
He didn't just talk about it, he lived it. And there is no greater way to teach than by example.
Yeah.
You don't have to talk.
Yeah.
You just demonstrate to people. And it's not an easy way to live, but the satisfaction it brings you internally, and the position it allows you to move into outside of yourself in the community and even into the spirit world. I mean, you elevate your own place in those spaces to become closer to the source, Kisemantu, who gave us all of these things. Yes. Those are beautiful stories.
Yeah.
I mean, even just telling them, and I sit and I watch it and I see people, being so emotionally affected. But they're trying not to show it, because that's not what we do. But that was quite common practice in the old days. In fact, there were warriors who were noted for their bravery and their strength and their unyielding personalities, who would go sit near a camp on a hill and spend the morning, sometimes the entire day, sitting up there crying. And people could see and hear them. And they knew this person is setting free the grief of our community. He's one of our criers.
Right.
Yeah. Because we need that emotional healing. Because so many of us are afraid to show or engage in that aspect. But here's a man in plain view who's sitting there crying like it matters, because it does. And he's saying, if you can't cry, I will cry for you, And they would bring him gifts after, thanking him for his service.
Yeah, so you hear lots about the chiefs and the warriors, the great warriors, I suppose. We've talked a little bit about some of the women, but, in the traditional society, from what I understand, everybody had a role. So you had scouts, you had criers, everybody had a purpose. And I wonder if that's a bit of what's been lost in our modern communities.
It has changed, it's not so expansive because it understands that you are part of creation. Now it's become, you are part of the political party or a congregation or, a community group or all of these things. Rather than connecting you, it's shrunk to, and the places that you've been told you now inhabit don't allow or are incapable of accepting you for who you really are. So we have to keep secrets, I can't tell them this. What will they think, or what will they judge me as? And so, that becomes part of the baggage that you take unless you find some way to resolve it. If you can't trust the people around you, go sit with the trees. Let the birds come and sit in a tree and speak to them. Let the thunders come. Let the sun shine, the wind blow, the earth, all the plants. And say, these are the things that concern me. And I want to understand them. And so I set them free here. Help me carry them. Help me understand them so that I can grow from here. Kaya sa muna. Ancient stories. An ancient perspective.
I had asked you once because you share stories with me in English, but if those stories come to you in Cree, and if you're translating them as you share them with me.
For me, they will often come in Cree. And I don't have to process it. I just have to internalize it and get them rooted. But if I'm speaking with someone who doesn't understand the language, but I understand their language to some degree, then that whole practice of translation, that is not enough. You have to add into it the context, the times and place, the cultural transliteration. The cultural differences have to be understood and known in order to find the essence of the spirit that moves through that story, keeping it alive and flowing, and can flow into you. And the more adept I am with understanding your language, and the more adept I am and rooted in my own, the deeper we can both go together. You see? Yeah. And the deeper you go is a journey towards the holy places within. Places that were never seen, never felt, never heard. Open those doorways and set each other free.
Thank you for joining us. We look forward to continuing these conversations. Special thanks to Mr. Fine for sharing his wisdom and teachings. Much appreciation to the Lloydminster Public School Division Prairie Thunder Boys Drum Group for helping us to start and end each episode in a good way. We also want to acknowledge our friends and family and all those who have helped us along the way, including Startup Lloydminster for letting us use their space, Lakeland College for the equipment, and TELUS STORYHIVE for their support.